Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that can make it, thank you so much for being here. It's really fun to see a bunch of familiar names in the attendee list and a bunch of former students. And for those of you that I haven't met in person as well, welcome for being here. That's really fun for me too. So the topic of our conversation this morning is going to be, as you can see in the title, my dashboards are too slow. What can I do? Right, so probably something that most, if not all of us, have experienced numerous times. So just a quick background on me for those of you that haven't met me. I've been using Tableau for a number of years now, teaching courses and working on projects, some of which we'll talk about here today. And I've worked with a whole bunch of different organizations, helping them to implement Tableau and work on projects, everything from trying to figure out how to get their data formatted so that Tableau can use it, to building dashboards, to improving performance, which is really what we're talking about here today. And our focus at One Number is always just on helping companies to increase revenue and decrease costs and to use their data to be able to do that. So if you have ever seen this screen, this donut of death that just continues to spin over and over again, either when a dashboard is loading or you change a filter, then you're in the right place, because what we're going to be talking about today are a handful of steps that you can apply to fix issues like this when they arise. So I get asked this question a lot by students and colleagues, and it usually comes down to, do I have too much data for Tableau to handle? And a quick follow-up to that question is usually this: what are the row and column maximums that Tableau is designed to be able to load? And the truth is that there's not actually a stated maximum. I do have a generalized recommendation, which is, if you can keep your data source to something like 3 million rows and 50 columns, you're generally going to be in good shape. But different computers are going to have the ability to handle a different amount of data at separate speeds. So generally, when dashboards are too slow, it could be that there's a really large data source, but what it usually traces back to is this, just a limitation of hardware resources. And that's going to be both on your desktop computer, but then also in the server where your data is hosted if you're working with a database. So what we're not here today to talk about is hardware. Well, I'll leave that as a separate discussion for you with others. But what we are here to talk about is this: how to make your data environment as efficient as possible with using exactly what you have right now. Okay, so what can you do? We're going to look at 6 solutions to be able to solve those problems when the donut of death arises. So you can see a couple of these are going to be outside of Tableau, and then the rest of them are going to be things that you can do from within Tableau itself. All right. So we'll go ahead and jump into our first solution. And that is going to be to pre-aggregate your data before it gets to Tableau. So I've got a snapshot of a data source here. It's some restaurant sales information. And as you can see, there is a separate row of data for every single order and item on that order that occurred at a different restaurant on a different day. Right. So I've actually got an Excel file of this. I will flip over so that we can see it in its entirety. Right. It looks like this. So I think we're talking about something like 30,000 rows of data when all is said and done. But let's say that we don't really need that much detail, because we're just looking to create a dashboard like this: high-level sales performance. That those top numbers, those summary tiles, are just the number of sales per restaurant, and then those bars down below are sales by day. So we definitely need both of those dimensions still, but we don't need item information. So there are 2 ways of using tools that you probably already have access to be able to do this. And of course, there are a whole lot of other tools that can do this as well, but we're just going to look at 2 examples today. So the first would be to use a SQL group by statement to be able to aggregate this data. And then the second would be to use an Excel pivot table. Okay, so here's an example of a custom SQL statement that we can actually create within Tableau. So if you're like, oh, like I know a bit of SQL, but maybe it's not your strongest suit, that's okay. Tableau actually has some tools that make this pretty simple. Okay. So what I'm going to do is open up Tableau, and what we're going to do is connect to the Excel file with that restaurant level sales information. And notice if I hit this default here, which is probably what everybody does every time, because why would you not? It looks like this. Right? So just got my worksheets within my Excel file listed here, a couple things I could do like union. But if you have worked with tables from a database, you'll know that there is a section down here that says new custom SQL that pops up when you're doing that. So in scenarios where you're pulling tables from a SQL database, that option is a default. It is not for a file type data source like Excel. However, a lot of people don't know is you can actually get that same kind of functionality for an Excel file. But here's what you got to do. I'm going to go back to before we connected to this data source. I'm going to go connect to it again, except for this time, rather than hitting this default open here, I'm going to hit this drop down to the side of it and select open with legacy connection. Right. So this is sort of this holdover. This has been a part of Tableau for many years, but it just isn't used that much anymore for whatever reason. But what it does is it allows you to use Tableau's internal data engine to apply SQL to something like an Excel sheet. So I'm going to pull this table, the sales mix report, in here. It looks like this. And again, remember, we don't need all 30,000 rows, every single row for every single item, but we just want one row of data for each restaurant for each day and a summary of how much we did in sales and profit. So what I'm going to do is hit this data drop down on my toolbar and select convert to custom SQL. So what this is going to do is it's going to take this sheet that we just pulled in and that Tableau dragged and dropped and converted into columns for us. And rather than what Tableau has done is use its own native language, BizQL, to do this. But what Tableau is going to show us is how it would do this with SQL. So I select that, it looks like this. Okay, and then remember, we don't need item. We don't need level, which is just like item grouping, like is it a drink or a piece of food or what. But we do want these other fields. Okay. We're going to want to summarize these measures though, profit, sales, and quantity. So go ahead and sum those here. Oops. And the last thing we're going to add is this, an additional line of SQL that says group by. Put this date field in, add a comma, and then this entity field. Okay, I'll pause there for a second, and we're going to provide a recording for this as well, but in case you're typing this down or taking a screenshot, I'll pause there. Okay, so I hit OK at this point. And a decent amount of consolidation has happened because we've dropped off 2 columns of data, right? So you do the math, we lost 2 columns out of 7 total. We're already looking at a significant reduction. And then we've also are down to 155 rows out of the original 30,000. And so what we can do with this, we can still go and create those worksheets just like what we were looking at on the slideshow just a minute ago. We've got sales by day. I'm not going to spend too much time prettying this up. We could also look at sales by entity. Basically, all this flexibility that we need is still incorporated here. And then just to show you, we're talking about 155 rows, whereas the original data source something like, yeah, nearly 30,000, right? So not only have we knocked off a couple of columns, but we also had a huge reduction down to a couple percentage points of what that original data source was. So anywhere where this kind of consolidation is possible, I would highly recommend doing that. Okay. Going back here, we also mentioned that it's possible to create an Excel pivot table to do the same thing. I'm not going to necessarily show, all the steps to do that, but I will to show you this. So this was our original data source, right? And what we did is we used the pivot table functionality from within Tableau to basically do that exact same consolidation. If we scroll down, you'll see that this is also 155 rows. So if you have additional questions on that at the end of this webinar, just let me know. I'm happy to share more about this pivot table. Okay. So the next thing I would say is this. We were working with a client actually just about a month ago, and what we found is that they had a lot of complex calculations in their Tableau workbook. They didn't have, their data source wasn't too large. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I want to say it was maybe a couple 100,000 rows and I don't know, maybe something like 30 to 50 columns. So not astronomical by any means. But what we found was they had a bunch of calculations that were taxing Tableau really heavily. And Tableau is primarily a data visualization tool. And then it has the capabilities to do some kind of data work as well on top of that. But it's really not meant to be kind of the heavy lifting horse that pulls the sleigh as far as preparing data. And so, when you've got a bunch of complex fields with things like count distincts, a whole bunch of level of detail functions, regular expressions, things are at least at risk to bog down. So if you have a scenario like that, what I would recommend is, as much as possible, to move those calculations to your data source itself. Okay, so we're going to dive back into custom SQL world here, and I promise this one's actually even less involved than our last. So I actually want to tell a story to introduce this concept, custom SQL parameters, and that's this. I was working with a restaurant chain that has hundreds of locations, and they were having a big issue because they had hundreds of locations. They wanted to display a couple years worth of data so that they could do year-over-year comparisons for different values like same-store sales and things like that. And then, so they had a couple hundred locations, a couple years worth of data, and then every single transaction as part of this data source, right? So you can imagine if a store does a couple thousand transactions a day, we've got a couple hundred stores, we got several hundred different days worth of data. We're talking about many millions of rows. I don't remember the exact details. I want to say it was in the tens of millions, maybe up to something like 50 million. So it just, as you can imagine, wasn't working that great. And what we were actually trying to do was just provide a dashboard that would give a store snapshot. So how is this store doing compared against itself last year? We weren't necessarily trying to look at all these stores side by side. So what we realized was we were applying some filters within Tableau that we might actually be able to push upstream. Let's dive into what that means. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this same data, the sales mix report. And I'm just going to write this table in. This time we've got all the data. And at this point, I'm going to hit this data drop down again and convert to custom SQL. But I'm just going to leave it for now. Okay, so we're good. Now we're going to go build a worksheet. And it's going to look like this. Let's just say we're looking at sales by day. And we want to see that broken out by entity, which is just the data field for location. Okay, so it looks like this. So what I'm going to do is to create a parameter based on this field entity. I'm just going to call this select location. And I'm going to show this parameter control. This parameter is not tied to anything yet. So as I flip through it, nothing happens. However, what I can do is go back to my data source. And I'm going to edit this custom SQL query. And just add one line of SQL here. It's going to make a huge difference. I'm going to say this. Select all these different things, all these different columns of data, where this field entity equals, and then check this out, you can insert a parameter here. So where entity equals whatever the parameter the output says at that time. So essentially, this is sort of like a dynamic data source filter. So what Tableau is going to do is it's going to grab all this stuff, and then it's going to funnel whatever data fits this actually into our workbook. So in this case, we've got 5 restaurants. So we've whittled it down to 1/5 of our original 30,000 rows of data. But you can imagine if we had 200 restaurants, we're talking about 1/200, which was just a huge, huge performance gain. Okay. So similar to a custom SQL parameter is a data source filter. So a data source filter is not dynamic in the same way that a custom SQL parameter is, but it has very similar effect on performance. We'll look at how to create that. I'm actually just going to use some Superstore data here. That looks familiar to you if you've taken any of those courses before. I'll take orders in here. And what we're going to see is we've got something like 17,000 rows of data. Yeah, looks like this. But let's say we're just doing an analysis, just sales in the United States. Let's put something together here. So one thing I could do is this. I could filter down to just the United States on this filters card. But what I'm going to see is that all of that data, all 17,000 rows, have still flowed into our workbook, and now we're just filtering them from there, right? And so we're going to see, just to see 17,000 rows originally. So let's pare this down to just the United States, figure out how many rows of data this actually would be. Right, so less than 10,000, so a little over half of all the data is in the United States itself. So it works to filter within Tableau, but if we don't need international data at all for the analysis we're going to be doing, then it really doesn't make a lot of sense to bring it into our workbook at all. So I'm going to go back to my data source, and notice the top right here, I have this option to add filters, and this is where you add what's called a data source filter. So select this, add filter based on country. Just select United States. Okay. Notice there's one filter listed there now. And if I go back to my worksheets, I don't need this filter anymore because that data has been filtered before it even got into Tableau. So highly recommend using those when you know that there are segments of your data that you don't need at all for the analysis you're doing in a specific workbook. Okay, probably a lot of you know about extracts already, but just a quick primer for those who don't. The way that Tableau generally works when it has a live connection to a database is this. So you create a workbook and you published it to your Tableau server. So anytime that the database tables that you're working on update, that workbook is going to refresh and that live connection is maintained, right? So essentially, Tableau's got this bridge to gap between your Tableau server and your database server. So it's got to move the data back and forth along this bridge. And on top of that, it's actually got to translate the data as well. So if your data is stored in SQL, Tableau has to translate it to VizQL to be able to use it appropriately within your workbook. Same thing will be true of an Excel table. It's just stored in rows and columns, and then needs to get converted to VizQL. So what an extract does is it solves both of those problems. It gets a snapshot of your data that is saved locally, and that data is already translated for use in your workbook in Tableau, which is just going to save a whole bunch of processing power and time. I've worked with clients before where they had a filter that they would change, and it could take a minute to update their workbook. We created an extract, and they were down to under a second. So just spend a minute on this one. Hopefully it's familiar, but if not, the way you create an extract is just this. You right-click on your data source at the top of your data window. Select Extract Data. Notice I've got a data source filter, so that shows up there. That's just fine. And you just select Extract here. Notice this button, Hide All Unused Fields. We're going to come back to that one in just a minute. Just know that that's there. So we hit Extract. Tableau is going to prompt us to save this locally. Save. I'll just say yes. We'll save over that. And then watch specifically our top left corner up here in the top of our data window. Watch this symbol go from a cylinder to 2 cylinders. Right, so that is our visual cue that we are now running on an extract, not a live connection to the database. Okay. So you might be wondering, well, that might be nice to run on an extract, but then it's a snapshot of the data. So what do we do from there? How do we get new data? If you're working on Tableau desktop, you can just manually refresh an extract. When you publish a workbook to Tableau server on an extract that's connected to a database, you have some different options for how you want to refresh it. Very common is to set up a full refresh. So what a full refresh does is it will just entirely write a new extract that is, again, going to be saved locally on the Tableau server. You can set that up to happen on a regular basis. It could be once a week, once a day, every 15 minutes. You could also set up an incremental refresh. So what an incremental refresh does is it just adds new rows to your extract, right? So let's say that you've got an extract that went all the way up to yesterday, November 16th, and then you want that extract just to incremental refresh today. It will just add November 17th data. Okay. And then finally, you can use some of Tableau server's native language to set up what's called a triggered refresh. And what that does is when the data source itself updates, it will create a new extract. So if you have a data source that only updates every so often, and you just want the extract to update when the data source updates, you could set one of those up. Okay, and then finally, hiding unused fields. This is just a great way to reduce column counts in general. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. I typically do this in conjunction with an extract. You don't have to necessarily. So I'm going to go back to before we had an extract in this data source. And if you manually hide fields, let's say, I don't really think I ever need this field, I don't know, row. So I'm going to hide that and then create my extract. That column will not become a part of this extract. And actually, since we've hidden it, when Tableau, even with a live connection, when we filter, that column's not going to get hit anymore. So that's going to help a lot with increasing speed. And so notice that that row field is gone. If you ever do that, like you hide a field and you realize that you need to bring it back later, just deselect Use Extract, right-click in your data window, Show Hidden Fields. Notice that row shows up and it's kind of grayed out. You can just right-click on that to unhide it. And then I told you we'd come back to this button in a little bit. It's been a little bit. So under this extract data, you also have this option to hide all unused fields. So if you aren't sure, like let's say you've got a lot of fields and you just want to make sure that you aren't pulling a bunch of ones in you aren't using, could hit hide all unused fields and then extract, and then watch my data source or my data pane as this happens, right? It knocks it down to only just those fields that are being used in a worksheet somewhere. So what I recommend if you do that is just to have an extra worksheet where you park fields that you're not currently using, but think that you might. And then again, just like before, you can always deselect use extracts, unhide fields, and bring them back. And we were working with a client this summer, and they were using extracts. Their data source wasn't too large, but things were really slow. And we found out by using that show hidden fields feature that out of their 1,400 columns of data that they had, they were only using less than 40 of them. So by doing that, we were able to, increase speeds by like 10x what they were before. So to recap, 6 solutions for speeding up your workbooks: aggregate your data before Tableau, transfer calculations to your data source, use data source filters, consider a custom SQL parameter if that would work for you, use extracts, and hide unused fields. Okay. So for our last couple of minutes here, what we would love is your feedback. So we've got 3 ways to do that. The first is this. If you go to our website, onenumber.biz, that's B-I-Z, there's going to be a link at the top with a banner. And that's a link to an in-person 2-day workshop that we're hosting in Seattle at the end of the month to be able to address questions like this and work on how to get your data to work well with Tableau. So we are actually working on finalizing reservations today, and we've just got a few spots left. So if you are interested in attending, I would recommend reserving your spot today. So that's one way. Another thing would be this: if you have a complex data question that you would like me to follow up with you on for a further conversation, if you could just type data into questions, then we'll make sure that we follow up with that. And then the final thing would be this: if you have a question that you just like to ask now in front of the group, if you could just type question into the questions box, or even just type what your question is, then we would be happy to talk about that just now. So I will just pause here for a second and open up my GoToWebinar dialog box and see what you guys got. Okay, so the first question is here. Is incremental refresh possible when the data source is a SQL Server database connection? Yes, that's true. That is possible. Let's see this next question. I have successfully published a live workbook to Tableau server, but how do you publish with an extract? Do you have to save the extract to the Tableau server, and will it prompt you to do that? Yes, it will. So when you publish, the extract will just publish up with your workbook. You publish it separately if you want to, but it will just be included as part of your workbook by default. And then the last question was, could I show how to remove the unused field again when extracting? Yeah, so just pop into that. So one more time, if you hit a field and you realized after the fact that you actually wanted to bring it back. So actually right now, this is perfect. We're on an extract. I'm going to deselect use extract. And actually, I've already hit the show hidden fields before. But if I had not, let's see if I can get that to recreate that. Well, what you would do is just right click here in your data window. And if you had not hit show hidden fields before, there's going to be an option for that down here. And at this point, what I would do is this: the field I wanted to bring back, I would right click on it, unhide it. Notice it goes from a gray label to a black label. And I'm just going to go, maybe just park this in a worksheet somewhere. So now if I extract my data again, region won't be taken out this time. Okay, great. Any other questions that we can answer before wrapping this up? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so if I missed anything, definitely just feel free to email me. And if you are watching the recording and you had additional questions or would like to follow up or have another conversation, then you can always reach me at my email address, which is eric.parker@onenumber.biz. Okay? So thank you so much for joining, for all of you that can make it today, and looking forward to being in touch with you, and have a great weekend.